All right, thanks everyone for being here. I can't really see the audience, so so this talk is about what happens once people share about stigmatized information on identified social media. And before I start, I wanted to note that the talk includes content about pregnancy loss. When people experience distress or stigma due to life experiences or identity facets, they often feel the need to talk about these experiences with other people. Sometimes they do so in person, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they do so on social media, and sometimes they don't. These sharing decisions are complicated online and in person, in part because of the stigma associated with these topics and talking about them. Social media platforms provide new contexts for people to engage in such expressions of self. Platforms like these ones support some degree of perceived anonymity, separation from networks of known ties, and topic specificity on platforms like Reddit or Baby Center, where people are able to engage in specific topics, exchange support, do identity work, and cope. But then there's also these other platforms like Facebook, where people are typically connected to other people that they somehow know in their day-to-day life, like colleagues and coworkers or old high school friends and family and such, where they typically use their physical word names and identities, where they're not anonymous, and they may not know of other people with similar experiences in their lives. So let's call these platforms identified social media, a platform like Facebook in today's world. The features that I describe here make disclosures of stigmatized experiences more challenging and risky on identified platforms compared to other platforms, such as those ones on the left. This paper discusses what happens once people do share about stigmatized experiences on identified social media. So specifically, I ask, when facing stigma and distress, what outcomes do people perceive as a result of disclosing unidentified social media and reactions from their networks of known ties on these platforms? By understanding the outcomes associated with stigmatized disclosures occurring on identified social media, as made and perceived by the individuals who perform them, I contribute to our knowledge about how social computing systems can be designed to facilitate desired disclosure outcomes and hinder unwanted outcomes for the disclosures. Some background. From prior work, we know that disclosures on identified social media can lead to increased tie strength, social capital and social support access, feeling more connected after more positive kinds of disclosures, and improved subjective well-being. Those works are largely in generic context, not focusing on any specific kind of stigmatized experience. But the focus on stigma and identified spaces is key here because it complicates disclosure decisions, response decisions, and their outcomes. In stigmatized settings, past research has largely focused on important measures such as social support and well-being. But I ask, what else happens when people share about stigmatized experiences on identified social media? And in this work, to answer this question, I focus on the pregnancy loss experience. Literature suggests that pregnancy loss is an experience that is often traumatizing for many who experience it. It's stigmatized, it's difficult to disclose and seek support for, and it influences people's well-being. It's associated with depression, PTSD, and it challenges many people's sense of self and identity, as well as their social relationships. And reactions in in-person settings where people do talk about their experiences with loss are often perceived to be unsupportive or sometimes outright hurtful or inconsiderate. So it provides a really rich and important context to investigate disclosure outcomes in stigmatized settings. Outcomes are related to disclosures and responses to them. In other work, I've explored how people make these disclosure decisions. So how do people decide to share about pregnancy loss experiences on social media platforms? And how other people decide to engage or respond to these disclosures when they do happen on social media platforms. That's another talk on Thursday. And in this work, I look at how, at the kinds of outcomes that people perceive once they do disclose on identified platforms. I conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews with women women in the U.S. who had experienced pregnancy loss in the past 2 years, were over 18, lived in the U.S., and used social media. I used a screening survey, which led to 27 interviews. This particular analysis draws on 12 of these 27 interviews because of the focus of this paper, which is about outcomes that participants perceive as a result of actually disclosing on an identified social media platform. I analyzed the data using the constant comparative approach, and then I organized my findings by adopting a framework related to disclosures of concealable stigmatized identities in in-person and non-computer mediated settings from traditional communication literature, which identifies individual, dyadic, and social contextual level outcomes. And I find that participants perceived their social media disclosures about pregnancy loss to have outcomes on the individual, dyad, and what I call the social network level outcomes. Some of these outcomes that are marked by little stars are related to responses to disclosures when they do happen, and other ones are not really related to the responses and reactions that people receive and are just about the disclosures actually happening. So, in this talk, I will go over some examples of the ones that I've bolded here, related to destigmatizing pregnancy loss as an outcome, stronger interpersonal relationships, connecting with similar others within one's network of known ties, and transitioning into a supporter and mentor role within one's network of known ties. So as you see, 3 of these outcomes are related to responses to disclosures. Starting with destigmatization. Reciprocations that happen through comments or private messages were a common response to disclosures when they did happen. So these are the kind of responses where someone posted something about their experience and they received responses such as like, me too, I know what you're going through, I've gone through this as well, here's my story. In talking about such responses, this participant said, it's somebody trying to reach out to you, to share what happened to them, to probably, in a way, normalize miscarriages, to let you know that you're not alone, and like I said, to share something about themselves or something to help you to feel better. Participants thought that reciprocations in response to their disclosures normalized and destigmatized pregnancy loss and talking about it. Moving on to individual level outcomes, I'll go through 2 examples: transitioning into a mentor-supporter role within one's network of known ties, and connecting to similar known others. Many participants transitioned into a new social role within their networks of known ties, and sometimes within extended networks, so networks of friends, after sharing about their loss on social media. This role entailed assuming a mentorship role through becoming a source of support, relying on one's personal experience with pregnancy loss and their openness about it. So this person said, and I've had people who've had miscarriages since then who have sought me out first and said, I think I'm having a miscarriage. How do I deal with this? Because they know I've been through it and they know I'm open about my experience. This kind of reciprocal disclosures from members of one's network of known ties on identified social media was more meaningful than those from anonymous strangers on other platforms like Reddit or Baby Center for some participants. So as an example, this participant said, the outreach that I received on Facebook was more meaningful. The face-to-face relationship was there, even if it's somebody I was not always in contact with anymore. It was people who were not necessarily going through it at the moment, because at Baby Center, most are currently struggling with that or dealing with it in some way. Whereas on Facebook, it was friends who I knew this happened years ago, and have had since kids or have had other things happen in their lives. Just more meaningful in that sense. It's real faces that I know and realize. Moving on to interpersonal relationship changes as an example of a dyadic level outcome. Participants felt closer to others who shared their stories with them, often regardless of the perceived level of initial relationship closeness or how frequently they were in touch with them. As an example, this participant said, "Yeah, it definitely changed the relationship with my husband's cousin. As someone who previously I'd been friendly with, I can't say I knew much about her, or vice versa. But since the loss, I think I suddenly identify very strongly with her. And I feel like she was very emotionally supportive. I think I'll always feel very close to her in that regard, even though to this day, we don't see each other much beyond the family functions we saw each other at before." So here you see how helpful connections and really meaningful connections following disclosures originated from various kinds of ties through diverse communication channels, both more kind of private messages as well as comments. So some takeaways. Disclosures of stigmatized experiences on identified social media can lead to outcomes on 3 levels: individual, dyad, and social network level outcomes. And there is a lot of things that I discuss in the paper and I'm happy to talk about later. While support, reciprocity, and connecting with similar others are also possible and also very helpful in more anonymous spaces like Reddit or Baby Center or other spaces, interpersonal relationship outcomes, such as closer relationships, even with weaker ties, traditionally perceived as weak ties, some reciprocity-related outcomes, like perceiving that there's less stigma around talking about a topic, and some outcomes related to networks of known ties, such as connecting with similar others within one's network of known ties, or assuming new social roles within one's network of known ties, such as becoming a source of support and mentor within one's network, are unique to identified contexts. Meaningful interactions and outcomes stem from diverse ties with various pre-disclosure strength levels through a variety of communication channels with diverse privacy levels. So it wasn't the case that it was only closer ties and one's family or like closest friends who responded and were able to make meaningful connections with the poster, but it was also people who were not necessarily super close to this person prior to this disclosure, but that shared experience really provided that setting within which meaningful interactions happened. So social media newsfeed algorithms should take into account that even though sharing sensitive information is challenging, a lot of times when people do take that step to talk about their experiences online, they look for and need helpful interactions. And such interactions can originate from various kinds of ties through different communication channels. And as such, showing content to only ones what a platform would assume are closer ties traditionally, or with whom one interacts with more frequently, may not necessarily be the best approach to designing newsfeed algorithms if we want to promote connections that are meaningful to people, particularly in times of personal distress. And finally, I argue that both connectivity within and separation from networks of known ties are key in designing social media sites to foster beneficial disclosures of self and social support exchange in stigmatized contexts. Prior work establishes that anonymity is an important feature in designing online spaces for seeking support and disclosing experiences that are stigmatized. Prior work has also shown that sometimes disclosures on more anonymous settings can then help people to feel more comfortable to talk about their experiences in a more identified setting. Prior work also shows that people use several social media platforms to separate networks of known ties from other ties that they might not actually even know in person, who may better understand what they're going through, especially during life transitions. My findings complicate these insights from prior work by showing how even becoming aware that similar others even exist within one's network of known ties, identifying them and connecting with them, and connecting with them is also very powerful for individuals experiencing distress and stigma. And I suggest that social media site designs should leverage the power of connectivity, including among similar others, within networks of known ties, and the need for privacy, separation, and anonymity. And with that, this was a solo-authored paper, but I collected the data that I used to analyze this work when I was a student with Andrea Forte. And obviously, this work would not have been possible without the support and trust from the participants who helped me learn from their experiences, and folks who provided support and encouragement and feedback on earlier versions of this work. And with that, I'm happy to take questions now.
If you have a question, if you could raise your hand clearly, that would be, we have a question just over here on the left.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit
Where are you?
Oh, I'm down here. Hi. Sorry. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, to your last point there, how people sort of chose their audiences or discovered them on identified social media. Because I could imagine that even within a large friend network on identified social media, you would have people who might stigmatize a disclosure. So did you find it was kind of like private messaging? Or
There's some echo. Could you maybe...
Yeah. Is this better?
A little bit better, yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to start over?
Yes. Could you just repeat the questions again?
Sure. Mostly just asking about how people... identified their audiences and, kind of chose their audiences on social media.
Yeah, so the way that people thought about whom to share with and how and why not, that's a separate piece of work that I've published at CHI 2018. But in general, there's a lot of complexity that goes into whom people decide to share with, and it largely depends on the goals and the motivations that people have for sharing. So, for example, and I discussed in that other paper, if someone wants the news to be known, and because, let's say, they had announced that they were pregnant, and then now they don't want to engage in specific kinds of follow-up questions and that kind of thing, then that's a big reason for people to then engage in disclosing. So the audience in that sense ideally would be large and in a very efficient way. Other times people want to engage in interactions with people who might be able to gather signals that in ways that are more indirect and vague, for example. So there's different kinds of expressions that are not necessarily, hey, I experienced this, but rather more indirect. And I'm happy to chat later about that other work.
I should say as well, if you could say your name and your affiliation before you ask the question, that would be great. And we have one more question. We've got time for one more question just there.
I think Maura had her hand up.
Hi, Naz. This is Maura Burke from Facebook. This is great work. Thank you. I'm wondering if any of your participants talked about the different kinds of responses they got when they shared their personal networks versus in a Facebook group. Are Facebook groups more generic baby center?
Yes. Yes, happy to talk about that. So there were different kinds of responses that people got in a Facebook personal Facebook space. There were comments around kind of generic comments like "sorry for your loss," nothing more intimate or personal, which are also helpful for most people. But some people thought that they were not super helpful or intimate. There were also other kinds of comments where more around "me too, I get what you're going through," and kind of reciprocations. But there were also other kinds of more intimate connections that followed up. People followed up in private messages or other kinds of text messages, phone calls even sometimes from closer ties. But Facebook Messenger was actually interesting in that it wasn't necessarily the case that people who were necessarily close to this person felt that they could private message when the shared experience really met that bar for people to be like, no, I really need to talk to this person. Whereas on more the specific support spaces like Facebook groups or subreddits and such, it was a lot of people largely use those for informational needs a lot of times, but also emotional support where some people feel more comfortable to only talk to others whom they know that have their shared experience. But what's interesting here is that once people take that step to talk about their experiences to their networks outside of these separate spaces, then a lot of disclosures follow from other people in response to them, and also not necessarily even in response to them. So I've had participants talk about how they've shared about their experiences because someone else posted about their experience, and then they decided to separately on their own Facebook profile talk about their experience.
Thank you very much, Naz.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you.